But let me just give you a flavor of the thing that we do. That
Yeah, because the feedback I often get from parents is, yeah, it's nice, the story about the relational poverty in the Western society, but my child is peeing in his closet every night, or my child is he or she can't eat, he throws up. It's the practical stuff from the trauma, the lying, the stealing, the manipulation, that makes it so hard. And also, especially the two faces, you know, to strangers, they're like angels, and at home, they are like, hard to deal with.
It's definitely, let me just pull this up here. Absolutely. You know, the specific, I didn't really explain it, but some of those symbols on those maps were for clinicians. Mm-hmm. Some of the symbols were for educators and schools. And then some of the symbols were for parents and caregivers. So we have a model where we teach parents about these core concepts. And a big part of that is helping them understand how to help minimize some of these behavioral problems in the household. Because if you don't, you know, these kids can be very, very, very challenging to parent.
Yeah.
And it leads to exhaustion and demoralization. And, you know, sometimes parents just, you know, their own mental health suffers in significant ways. It's really hard to deal with some of these kids.
Yeah, exactly. But if you would be my therapist and I come to you and I say, okay, my child is stealing all the time, my child is lying all the time, how would you start to help me? Where does that start?
Here's what I would start is I'd say that I don't understand why they do that, but if we do a developmental history and do this assessment, we may get some clues about where to, you know, how to start dealing with this in a way that's going to lead to some change. And so, again, let me just switch to this and just show you. Part of what we do is we do what we call psychoeducation.
Yeah.
So we try to teach the parent a little bit about why we are going to make some recommendations. Because if I talk to a parent and I came in and said, listen, you know, they're lying, they're stealing, and what you need to do is make sure they go for long walks and get to jump on the trampoline. They look at me like they look at me like, what?
Yeah.
You're crazy, and then they just leave.
Yeah. Well, that's the challenge that I have, because I know what it means, because I did it. I mean, I have the trampoline in my office. I had it many years downstairs. There it is. I was on it before I was meeting you. I had it in my, you know, I had my whole living room trauma informed, because I got it. And then I could heal my child so much. I want to pass your knowledge on. I want to pass the knowledge from the Healing Heart Cats on. But people are looking at me like I'm crazy, exactly like you said.
Right.
But maybe you can explain this now.
So this is what we try to do. We try to help people understand the reason that we would make these recommendations.
Yeah.
And so we start with, this is our, you know, the most common basic, we call it a heuristic, but just think of it as a model. It's a cartoon. And it really is just trying to show two things. The first thing is that the brain is organized kind of from bottom to top. And the top part of the brain is where you do your thinking. You know, the top part of the brain is where speech and language and values and telling right from wrong, all of that is up in the cortex.
Yeah.
And as you go lower in the brain, you kind of get to these simpler regulatory functions. Yeah. Now, the second thing that we wanted to show people is that there are these really, really important regulatory networks that originate in the lower part of the brain and then spread out to every part of the body and to every part of the brain. And because of this important, we call it microarchitecture, because these systems go everywhere, these become the backbone of our stress response. And so if you have incoming input, let's say, you know, from the outside world that says, oh, there's a saber-toothed tiger, it comes into this right down to that alarm, low part of the brain. It sends an alarm signal to those networks I just mentioned. And then they go and turn off certain parts of the brain and turn on other parts of the brain and body to help you get ready for threat. And now there's a couple things that are really important here. The first one is that all of your sensory input, every time, when you're looking at me and you see me on this computer screen and you hear me, that information goes to the lowest part of your brain first. And so the lowest part of your brain basically gets the first choice on processing that information. And so if there's, let's say when you were a young child, somebody who had a voice like mine was always yelling and cruel to your mother. And so and that would, when your brain was developing and very young, your brain would have made an association, a connection between a sound of a tone of voice like I have and threat. And so 30, 40 years later, you could hear somebody speaking and not even be aware of the fact that that person, for whatever reason, makes your skin crawl.
Yeah.
And this part of your brain, the thinking part of your brain, would go, I wonder why, I can't figure, why don't I like this? And you'd search for some reason why you don't like the person. But the reality is you had the feeling before you had the thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what we call this, our model is the neuro, that's sort of, that's signifying that we're trying to use this neuroscience lens. And then sequential. And that's basically acknowledging that the brain develops sequentially, the brain processes information sequentially. And we think that you have to do your therapeutic work sequentially. And so back to that original question about what would I do? So what we've developed this process that what we do is we've created a way to get a little bit of, now do you see one big screen, or do you see my?
No, I see a big screen and we are little on the side.
Little ones, okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and swap that.
Okay.
So now you should see a big screen, right? I hope. Do you see the slide?
And now it's smaller. Now, before
it was better before? Okay.
Yeah, it was better before. Yeah.
Okay, let me do this. That's better?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So what we've done is we've taken a bunch of functions that are really, fine motor skills tell you about parts of the brain, and sleep tells you about another part of the brain, and impulsivity tells you about another part of the brain. And so we were able to create basically a map of somebody's brain. And this, for example, is a child who had profound early life neglect and attachment problems. And he was adopted, and he was misunderstood by the mainstream systems. And so this is the way a regular 11 to 13-year-old would be organized. All of these capabilities would be pretty well normal or pretty organized. That's all this green stuff. And this is the way he was organized. And part of what happened was, and this is the narrative of what happens with so many kids like this, is that when he was 4 or 5 years old, he acted like he was 18 months old. He'd have temper tantrums. He wouldn't listen. He'd have meltdowns. He was touch aversive. People tried to touch him, and he didn't find that comforting. He found that escalating and dysregulating. And I think anybody who's worked with these kids or raised them knows what I'm talking about. And so they sent him off, and he got a whole bunch of different labels. And they used the regular treatment approach, and none of it worked. And he just got bigger and bigger and bigger and scarier and scarier. And they put him in residential, and then they put him in psychiatric hospitals, and they finally sent him off to a place that we work with in New Mexico. And they were just learning to use this model, this neurosequential model. And basically what we did was we look at, all right, well, here's where his strengths are, these greens, and his vulnerabilities are all these pinks and red areas, which means that he's struggling in really even in the lowest part of his brain. He's got really undeveloped regulatory capabilities. So it is true that he's got problems up here with speech and language and impulsivity and logic and all that other stuff. But until we address these problems first, we're never going to solve these problems up here.
Yeah.
So we started with very regulatory, pattern, repetitive, rhythmic, somatosensory stuff, and it took about a year, but he got to this point.
Wow.
And at this point, he was able to tolerate being in parallel relationships. And then we continued to do some of these regulatory things, but then we added in more relationships.
And for the viewers, when you say regulatory, repetitional things.
Yeah. I mean, things like walking, he would groom a horse, he would spackle, and paint, and he did, gardening, but all of that stuff is pattern, repetitive, motor activity.
Yeah.
And so he did a lot of those things that from a distance, if you looked at his day, you'd go, this kid gets up, he walks over there, he walks a mile, he paints on the barn, he milks a goat, he weeds the garden, he walks back to lunch. How is that therapeutic? Yeah. But again, if you believe me, I had to reassure the staff because they were used to, let's sit down and talk, and I'm going to change you. And the truth is, talking is a wonderful thing. But when you have a newborn baby and you talk about Einstein's theory of relativity to the baby, if you do it in this tone of voice, the baby will look at you and coo and make sounds, but the content of your words means nothing to the infant. All the infant hears is the prosody, the rhythm, the tone, the sweetness in your voice. And so you could be talking complete garbage. And so to the infant, it's the regulatory rhythm that is changing the lower parts of the brain. And as they get more mature and these systems come on board, then the words begin to have meaning. But in the beginning, they have meaning, the rhythm and the relational interactions gives them meaning. And so we started with regulatory stuff, and then relational stuff, and then ultimately we got to the part of the brain that can reason, that can think. And so by this time we were doing talk was part of the therapeutic process. But if you'd started here talking to him about what's right and what's wrong, and you need to do this, and these are the rules, it's like talking to a wall. He just wouldn't process it. And so this is what we would do. We'd say, all right, let's figure out where your child is, and this is a 15-year-old girl who was in the juvenile justice system, and they had severe attachment problems, and they were ready to put her in solitary confinement. And we were able to convince the court not to do that, to actually put her in a relational environment where she could be in parallel with people, and that they knew how to not escalate her. And literally what they did for the first few months here was with this girl is just walk around the town. Yeah. She didn't want to be at that place. She wanted to walk to the mall. She wanted to see her friends. And a staff member just walked with her and just made sure that when she was with her friends, she'd smoke cigarettes or whatever. They didn't do anything criminal. And then she'd walk back. And then she walked around there. And so literally they'd walk 4 or 5 hours a day. But It was pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity. And pretty soon she got to the point where she wanted to talk with the staff member. And then she told the staff member all kinds of, important things about her dreams and her hopes. And it evolved into a more traditional therapeutic interaction. But it started with regulation.
as simple as a walk, and not pushing them into talking, because most of them, they hate to talk because it's mostly about what did you do wrong and this is what you should do.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And again, I can absolutely understand why parents would focus on, you know, oh, they're stealing. Oh, they called me a name. Oh, and one of the hardest things is to calm make a parent feel safe with you as the therapist, to the point where they can hear you.